Welcome to Theology with Coffee. My name is Taylor Wood.
My name is Kelson Wolverton, and this is where we have casual conversations about deep biblical truths.
And we are continuing our study of the book of Revelation today. Now, as a reminder, the book of Revelation begins with a letter to 7 different churches. These letters to the 7 churches, they should not be taken separate from the rest of the book of Revelation. They are anchors that help us to interpret the things that we read in the apocalypse section of the book of Revelation. And if you could sum up these letters to the 7 churches, if you could just sum up overall the point that John is trying to drive home, what he is trying to encourage his original readers, what would you summarize that as?
Yeah, he's just giving the fact that there is hope and encouragement for those who persevere, that no matter how terrible, how hard persecution is, that ultimately the battle is going to be won by Jesus. And even if it's not here internally here on earth, there will be eternally in heaven with Jesus. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
The churches that he writes to, these are churches in Asia Minor that were experiencing persecution at the hands of Roman powers as well as supernatural forces that were seeking to destroy these churches. And these churches responded in varying degrees of faithfulness through this.
Right.
Now, in the apocalypse section, which we are currently in, it is itself divided into 7 different series of visions. The first of these is 7 seals. The second one is 7 trumpets, and that's where we find ourselves now. So you're probably hearing this repetition of the idea of 7 over and over and over. We've emphasized this. And Kelson, this number 7, why is it so significant in biblical literature?
Yeah, it just means perfection and completion. And we see it multiple times and examples, not only through the Old Testament, but also in the New Testament, and as well as here in Revelation. Yeah.
So the idea is that God is bringing his perfect judgment, his perfect will. He is manifesting that now to judge human and spiritual wickedness and bring about the salvation of his people who are faithful to him. Mm-hmm. And this is, again, the trajectory of the entire book of Revelation. It's helpful to break it down into simple ideas.
Right.
Because sometimes you get into the book of Revelation and you get into not so simple concepts, right? So, broad picture of Revelation is actually quite simple. It is this idea of perseverance under persecution and the rewards of faithfulness. We get into the nitty-gritty, that's where it starts to get complicated. But it's always good to kind of zoom out and look at the bigger picture as we dive back into the weeds of trying to figure out individual portions of the passage. And just as a warning, the scripture we're going to be dealing with today is one of these very complex, very difficult, very sophisticated passages that, frankly, we're going to have a lot of different options on how to interpret this stuff. Mm-hmm. We can give you our best interpretation, but this is a section of Scripture in particular that I'm not going to be overly dogmatic about. How do you feel about some of the material we're going to be covering today?
Yeah, no, absolutely, because it is going to be, as we read, like some wild stuff that's going to happen, and ultimately, no one really knows. And so I might have an opinion, but that doesn't mean that I'm right or anything, because there's just a lot that goes on here. Yeah.
All right. With that, I think I'm going to pick up, and I'm going to start in verse 6 of chapter 8 with the beginning of the 7 trumpets. And I'm going to read through the end of the chapter, which will take us through the first 4 trumpets. Now, the 7 angels who had the 7 trumpets prepared to blow them. The first angel blew his trumpet, and there followed hail and fire mixed with blood, and these were thrown upon the earth, and 1/3 of the earth was burned up, and 1/3 of the trees were burned up, and all the green grass was burned up. Now we're on to new material that we haven't covered yet. The second angel blew his trumpet, and something like a great mountain burning with fire was thrown into the sea, and 1/3 of the sea became blood, and 1/3 of the living creatures in the sea died, and 1/3 of the ships were destroyed. The third angel blew his trumpet, and a great star fell from heaven, blazing like a torch, and it fell on 1/3 of the rivers and on the springs of water. The name of the star is Wormwood. 1/3 of the waters became wormwood, and many people died from the water because it was made bitter. The fourth angel blew his trumpet, and 1/3 of the sun was struck, and 1/3 of the moon, and 1/3 of the stars, so that 1/3 of their light might be darkened, and 1/3 of the day might be kept from shining, and likewise 1/3 of the night. Then I looked, and I heard an eagle crying with a loud voice as it flew directly overhead, "Woe, woe, Woe to those who dwell on the earth at the blasts of the other trumpets that the three angels are about to blow. So right away, as we talk about these trumpets, keep in mind that trumpets are rich images in the Bible for a variety of things, but trumpets are often associated with the advancing of the Lord's army, the advancing of the Lord's purpose. Trumpets are also associated with the inauguration of kings, the inauguration of a new kingdom. And so these trumpets in and of themselves are sort of a rich image that comes up in a lot of different places that we've seen before in Day of the Lord theology, right? Yeah. And so anything else you want to add to this idea of the trumpets that are being blown here?
No, I think you added that all very well.
Like the seals that we saw, the seven seals, trumpets are associated with royalty. Right. And so this is royal image. And remember, all of this goes back to the heavenly throne room scene of chapter 4 and 5, where the king of Israel, the lion, the lamb, is the one who is worthy to open the seals. And by opening the seals, the trumpets are now being blown to inaugurate or initiate this new status quo, this new kingdom, this new reality of what this world will be. But first, the old world, the old system must be wiped away.
Right.
And that's what these seals and trumpets are initiating, is the wiping away of the old fallen system to make way for a new system, right? So that kind of catches us up to date with what's going on here. Now, just again, speaking in very broad strokes here before we start getting into the nitty-gritty, with these first four trumpets, you're going to notice a threefold cosmology that's playing out.
Yeah.
The first trumpet affects the earth. The second and third trumpets affect the seas and the waterways. And the fourth trumpet affects the heavens. This is interesting because this is also the way that creation itself is broken up into, where you have the creation of the heavens and the earth. You have the separating out of the high heavens with the lower heavens that occurs in the days of creation. And so, at the very least, I'm going to show you another connection that this has with the 7 days of creation. But at the very least, we have this kind of tripartite cosmology that John is talking about, where all of creation is being judged.
Yeah.
Earth, seas, and heavens, right?
Right.
Anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, no, I just think it's this beautiful picture of John going back and reflecting not only of Genesis, but then we're going to see, we talked about it this last episode, even with the Exodus with some of the plagues, and then also with just where we're at in Revelation of what is going on here at this specific time.
Yeah. And you bring up the other big broad stroke that I wanted to point out, which is the connections between these trumpets and the plagues of Egypt.
Yeah.
More so than the seals. The seals certainly had echoes of God's judgment on the earth, but these trumpets seem to be direct references to some of the plagues that occur in the book of Exodus. So you have the seventh plague that's talked about with the falling of hail and fire. You have the first plague with the turning the water into blood, and you have the ninth plague, the plague of darkness, that's occurring. And we talked about the last time we did Revelation 8, we talked about how you have both a broadening of these plagues that occur in Egypt, but also a limitation of these plagues.
Correct.
Okay?
Yeah.
So explain that.
Yeah. So, like, for example, when we talked about the first angel blowing its trumpet, yes, we have this hail and fire that's mixed with blood, and the trees are burned up, the earth's burned up, but not the grass. Where back in Exodus, we actually find out that with the plague of the hail, it affected everything.
Yeah.
It affected livestock, humanity, earth, grass, you name it, and completely destroyed everything. So that limitation is in Revelation, the grass isn't burned up. 1/3 of it is not. Yeah.
So when you're contrasting the plagues of Exodus with these trumpets here in chapter 8, you're observe that the plagues of Exodus are more limited in scope. They do not go as far. They're not worldwide. They're limited to the nation of Egypt. But they are broader in effect.
Yes.
The plagues of Egypt affect all of the things that they're doing. Here in Revelation, they are broader in scope. They are affecting the entire earth, but they are more limited in intensity. They are not doing all. The word that's being repeated here over and over is a third, a third, a third. There are exceptions, like you do have all the grass was burned up, but for the most part, there is a limiting effect. This limiting effect, I was meditating over this and why we have this happening. And first of all, we have an escalation from the seals. So in the seals, we saw this 1/4, 1/4, 1/4 being repeated. Here we see 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. 1/3 is obviously bigger than a fourth. Right. When we get to the bowls, it's going to get bigger again because it's going to be halves. So it's going to go from a fourth, a third, to a half. So we see this escalation. I also think with the third, you are seeing this idea that even when the trumpets are finished, God is not done yet.
Right.
There's still more to come. There is an intensifying effect that is going to take place from this point forward. And so even when the trumpets are finished, we should not expect that this cleansing away of the old system is yet complete. There's more to come, right?
Right.
So that's hinting at the fact that in the book we're going to expect more visions to come as we keep reading. So yeah, that sort of talks about this broadly speaking. Again, before we start dealing with specific verses, do you want to add anything else to kind of contextualize or make broad statements about what we're going to be dealing with?
Yeah, no, and even before that, we really talked about even just the fact with the angels and the bowl of incense and how that really relates to the holiday of the Day of Atonement, of looking at sin inwardly. And here we have the fact that before these trumpets even began, right, that after the seals, there was silence like in the heavens, and then the angels taking this fire, this coal that only from the Yom Kippur and this incense that only happened, to throw it down the earth to show judgment not only upon humanity, but upon all creation itself. And I think that's just really important.
And if that sounds kind of strange to you, like you've never thought about the connection between the Day of Atonement and the Day of the Lord, I encourage you to go back to our previous episode where we dealt with the first half of chapter 8.
Yeah.
Because there are very strong connections made with the final seal in the Day of Silence that initiates the trumpets and the Day of the Lord. So with that, let's go ahead and jump in and start dealing with this. Let's talk about this second trumpet, or the second angel who blows his trumpet. In verse 8, it says, something like a great mountain burning with fire was thrown into the sea, and a third of the sea became blood, and a third of the living creatures in the sea died, and a third of the ships were destroyed. Now, right away, when you talk about a great mountain burning with fire, what is one of the main images that comes to our minds?
Yeah, well, physically, I think of a volcano.
A volcano. Yeah. And would the people of this time have a reason to think about volcanoes
Absolutely.
In their context?
They certainly would, because at this time, we would actually see the volcano of Pompeii actually happen in Rome. So this would bring a lot of images that would come into play for the people that are persecuting and going through of like, oh, shoot, like the last days are coming, because it was such a great disaster that happened within the country of Italy.
Some of our listeners may be old enough that they remember the eruption of Mount St. Helens.
Yeah.
And if you remember, I mean, volcanic eruptions, there are few things in the natural world that are more destructive than volcanic eruptions. And generally speaking, a volcanic eruption involves many other forms of cataclysms as well. It brings about great darkness. It's often connected with earthquakes.
Yeah.
Volcanic eruptions can cause typhoons in maritime regions. They can cause great storms. They can damage crops. It's interesting because, of course, we're also seeing this unfolding of judgment, multiple different layers of judgment. Well, a volcano is a good picture of that, right? Because it's not just the eruption of the volcano that you have to worry about. It's all the other things that go along with that. And even to this day, I mean, like, rewind time 2,000 years, we are no better at dealing with or containing volcanoes today than what they were 2,000 years ago.
Right, absolutely. Because I also think back, too, about that volcano that happened in Hawaii, right? That completely wiped out multiple different islands that they're not even, sustainable to even live in any longer.
Yeah. So this was an image that all humans in general, and in particular these churches, this audience would be very familiar with. Does this necessarily mean that, though, that we should expect the eruption of a volcano to somehow be associated with the end times or the second coming of Jesus Christ? Well, certainly we could have some level of cataclysmic natural events, okay? And the Bible suggests this. We see this in Day of the Lord passages. We see this when Jesus talks about earthquakes and things like this. So it is fully, it is 100% natural to expect that given the unraveling of nature that's taking place, that is going to be associated with these cataclysmic events. But is there a deeper level of meaning to this? Is there another image behind this? And I think there is. I think probably Kelson agrees with me. So the first question we should ask is, and I'll just notice this. So it talks about a great mountain burning with fire. And again, that immediately we think of a volcano.
Right.
But the very next image talks about it being thrown into the sea. Now, that should cause some questions to come up in mind, because while we are familiar with volcanoes exploding, how often do you see a volcano being picked up and hurled and thrown into the sea? That's a bit of a more bizarre image.
Right.
And I think that's our first indicator that, yes, there is the picture of a volcano here, but that picture is meant to lead us to a deeper level of understanding, a deeper level of biblical interpretation than just the surface level of, oh, a volcano is blowing up and we have the unmaking of the cosmos of creation. So if you are studying your Bible, the next thing you should ask is, okay, does this image of great burning mountain show up in other places? And as a matter of fact, it does. Now, most scholars will point out a connection here between Revelation chapter 8 and Jeremiah chapter 51. Jeremiah 51 is a poem that talks about the judgment of Babylon. Keep that in mind, the judgment of Babylon. And in particular, I want to draw your attention to verse 25. I'll actually back up and look at verse 24 here of Jeremiah chapter 51. Before your very eyes I will repay Babylon and all the residents of Chaldea for all their evil they have done in Zion. This is the Lord's declaration. Look, I am against you, devastating mountain. This is the Lord's declaration. You devastated the whole earth. I will stretch out my hand against you, roll you down from the cliffs, and turn you into a charred, a burned mountain. No one will be able to retrieve a cornerstone or a foundation stone from you, because you will become desolate forever. This is the Lord's declaration. Now, what I want to point out here is that the nation of Babylon, which in Old Testament literature is sort of one of the great villains of the Old Testament. Babylon is one of the great seats of demonic power and evil power. It is called a devastating mountain. Again, think about this in terms of the ancient people. When you think of a devastating mountain, what do you think of as a volcano? So Babylon is being compared here to a volcano. But notice what God says. He says, when I judge you, I'm going to turn you into a charred mountain, a volcano that is harmless, a volcano that has been completely stripped of its power and of its sort of might. And so Jeremiah speaks of the devastating mountain being Babylon. That's a point of data that I want you to keep in mind as we move forward. As we continue to talk about this devastating mountain, the next place I want to go is Revelation 18. And it's going to talk about the throwing into the sea language there. But do you have anything you want to add to this idea here of Babylon being the devastating mountain?
Yeah, well, we're also going to see even that wordplay of Babylon actually happen in Revelation as we continue on, of this great empire, you know what I mean, this great nation that will seem like it won, but really in reality, it will be thrown, it will be devastated, that there will be judgment upon them.
Now, if you're wondering what Babylon has to do with Revelation, one of these days in the distant future, we'll get to Revelation chapter 18.
Right.
Revelation chapter 18 is the hymn of the fall of Babylon. And I got to take a break from Revelation 8 to provide a little bit of context here, because if you know anything about history, you know it'd be kind of weird for John to be talking about Babylon, right? Babylon has ceased to be a world power now for a very long time.
Right.
Babylon is actually replaced as a world power in the Old Testament. Babylon is overcome by the Medo-Persians. Eventually, the Persians become the dominant power between Media and Persia. Later, Persia is overcome by Alexander the Great and his Macedonian Empire, and this Hellenistic culture grows. What was Babylonia becomes Seleucia. I have entire episodes on the significance of the Seleucid Empire to biblical literature. And what was the Seleucid Empire would eventually become Rome. And so Rome has long supplanted Babylon as the seat of power in the sort of Mediterranean, Eastern European, Asia Minor sphere. Okay, so why is John talking about Babylon? Why does John spend so much time talking about the fall of Babylon when this is something that has already occurred and literal Babylon is not a threat to anyone anymore? Do you have any thoughts on that?
No, that was good.
Okay. Well, do you want to answer why he's talking about Babylon? Why Babylon is so important to John?
You can go for it.
Okay.
Yeah.
So again, Babylon becomes an image in the Old Testament of human wickedness paired with demonic wickedness. Babylon really is the great representation of dark spiritual forces working with evil human forces to oppose the will of God on this earth. And remember, in the eye of the Jew, Rome is not a separate power from Babylon. It's just the power that has supplanted Babylon. In other words, Babylon is now represented in Rome. Now, many scholars of Revelation, they will say, well, all this talk of Babylon, everything that John is going on here about, both in Revelation 8 that we just read, as well as Revelation 18, the hymn of the fall of Babylon, as well as the entire book, it is limited to the empire of Rome. John is primarily concerned with talking about how the Roman Empire is going to fall, and so the church doesn't need to be afraid. And I would say, yes, that's true, with a caveat. The caveat being that in the same way as Rome represents a type of Babylon, there is a future kingdom that also represents a type of Babylon. And John's view of this is not limited to Babylon only. It's not limited to Rome only, but it is also projecting into the future or telescoping into the future in this final great empire of Babylon that will be the empire of the Antichrist, which is going to be the dominant power when Jesus Christ returns. It is the world system that must be unmade and judged in order for Christ to bring about his perfect kingdom with a new heaven and a new earth. So I hope that makes sense of why John is talking about Babylon. Put another way, Babylon is not just Babylon.
Right.
Okay. Babylon is also Rome. But Babylon is not just Babylon, and it's not just Rome. Babylon is also the kingdom of the Antichrist, which, remember, we always talk about the already but not yet.
Yeah.
There's what the church is dealing with in the time of John, but there is also this eternal looking forward to what is going to occur in the future, in which John says, hey, all this dark spiritual power and human rebellion, it is going to culminate in this empire of the Antichrist. And it will be the judgment of the empire of the Antichrist which brings about the new kingdom of Christ. So hopefully that makes sense. Did that make sense?
Yeah, no, it makes complete sense. And even just to remind our listeners and viewers that, as you can see, Revelation has multiple underlinings of different things. So it's not going to be like this one solid, here's what that is going to mean. It's going to mean multiple different things, multiple different layers. Think of an onion. You got to pull, several layers, but they all work together to like form what Revelation is all about.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Not everybody likes onions.
I know.
Why couldn't it be a parfait? Points if you know what I'm referencing there. Okay. Do you know what I'm referencing there?
I think I do.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
All right, so let's continue in our parfait of Revelation, because you might be asking, okay, this is all interesting, Babylon, Rome, Empire of the Antichrist. What does this have to do with volcanoes being thrown into the sea? Well, I'm so glad you asked. Revelation chapter 18, verse 21. Then a mighty angel took up a stone, and stones and mountains are the same idea, took up a stone like a great millstone and threw it into the sea, saying, so will Babylon, the great city, be thrown down with violence and will be found no more. Now, what we have in Revelation chapter 18 is not just similar language. We actually have an interpretation for us of Revelation 8. Revelation 18 is telling us what this second trumpet means. The taking of the great fiery mountain. Remember, Jeremiah tells us the great fiery mountain is Babylon. The taking of this mountain and throwing it in the sea is the judgment and fall of Babylon. And keep in mind, Babylon refers not just to historic Babylon and not just to historic Rome, but also to the final empire of the Antichrist. And so I believe that the second trumpet is ultimately talking about the downfall of the culmination of human wickedness in governmental form. It is talking about the destruction of every human empire and kingdom that sets itself up against God through the ultimate and final destruction of the great human empire that sets itself up against God, the empire of the Antichrist, which John is calling Babylon here. Hopefully you tracked with that logic. What do you want to add to that?
No, I was going to say, we mentioned Jeremiah 51, 25 through 26, but that also goes with exactly what you talked about with Revelation chapter 18. We see it at the very end of the chapter where Jeremiah talks about, when you finish this book, tie a stone to it and cast it into the midst of the Euphrates, and say, thus shall Babylon sink to rise no more, because of the disaster that I'm bringing upon her, and they shall become exhausted.
Yeah.
Thus far the words of Jeremiah. So again, this act of like, oh, this is not a new concept. Jeremiah even said at the very end of chapter 51. So I just thought I would bring that up a little bit.
Yeah, so good. So once again, let's zoom out. We've zoomed in, now let's zoom back out. The second trumpet that we've just read, so all these trumpets, they're dealing with earth, water, heavens.
Yeah.
The second trumpet deals with the judgment of the earth, and it specifically says that all evil human kingdoms will be destroyed.
Right.
Generally. And specifically, the great evil empire of the Antichrist will be destroyed, and that is the judgment of the earth. Now we're going to move to the judgment of the seas, and these are going to be the next two, right? No. Sorry. The first trumpet was the hail. I've already gotten this wrong. That's the judgment of the earth. Then we have two trumpets, the second and the third, which is the judgment of the seas. So we've just seen the first half of the judgment of the seas. Now we're about to see the second one, which is the falling star. Okay. Now, do you want to say anything before we move on to the third trumpet and the star of wormwood? Yeah.
So that ties back to the first plague of Exodus, which is when the Nile itself turns to blood. And not only that, it affects the Nile River, it affects the fish that is also in it. And I think this is also interesting too, but this is where it changes differently in Revelation. Yes, it affects the living creatures in the sea that died, and the sea becomes blood, but it also says a third of the ships were destroyed, which I don't know about you, you're like, okay, that seems a little odd, right? We're talking about earth, trees, grass, creatures, you know what I mean? And then now we're talking about ships. But think about what we talked about with the fact with the sea. The sea represents chaos. It represents things that are out of control. And that with the sea can also think about not just land, but seas, oceans have more territory. And so with a kingdom, not only would you have land, but you would have territory of the sea, which would give so much power. And so here, I think it's so good what we're about to see, even with Wormwood, the fact even too with the earth, we see even the ships that think they have power over the seas are now going to be 1/3 completely destroyed, which I think is interesting to know.
The economic prosperity of nations has always been tied to their control of the seas.
Yeah, absolutely.
If you want to know who the richest nation at any given period of history is going to be, look at who controls the waterways, right? And so here, yes, you have this judgment of the economic prosperity of this great evil empire, right? Yeah, good pickup there. So with that, let's move on to the third. The third angel blew his trumpet, and a great star fell from heaven, blazing like a torch, and it fell on 1/3 of the rivers and on the springs of the water. The name of the star is Wormwood. 1/3 of the waters became wormwood, and many people died from the water because it had been made bitter. Now, right away, many scholars notice a lot of parallels and similarities between these two trumpets. In one, you have a great mountain that is on fire, picked up and hurled. In the other, you have a star that falls from heaven like a torch, and it falls. And the primary difference between these two seems to be the difference between throwing and falling, okay? Now, the reason why I think we have the throwing language there in the second trumpet is to tie us to Revelation 18, as well as Jeremiah chapter 51, the judgment of Babylon. Here we're getting falling language because that falling language is going to tie us to other places. It's going to tie us to different images. And you also have the seas being affected in both of these. Okay, one with the creatures in the seas being destroyed and the ships of the sea, and the other with the waters being made bitter, which is a judgment that God uses upon the people, and something that shows up frequently in the Old Testament as well. So there are great similarities between trumpets 2 and trumpets 3 here, both of which affect the seas. Okay, earth, seas, heavens. We're still in the seas. This section here.
Well, and I think it's also interesting to note, even goes with day of creation. We saw that affects like the third day, right? And then we talk about the second day and the fifth day when God creates the fish of the sea. And then we're going to also see not only is that the second day of the sea, but even the sixth day, it affects humanity. So we're seeing the fact of this cosmic that's happening right throughout the earth, but then even like the days of creation reversing itself of disaster and chaos.
Which, that's something else that ties us back to Day of the Lord. Day of the Lord stuff always ties into the unmaking of the cosmos, right? Or as Isaiah talks about, the rolling up of the scroll of the heavens, okay? And so, again, that's an intentional, that's a good pickup because it's an intentional reversal there of what occurs during the 7 days of creation that we're seeing take place here. Now, with this idea, so again, just like with the flaming mountain, immediately there is a physical phenomena that we think of when we think of a star falling like a torch and hitting the earth, and that would be a comet or asteroid impact upon the earth, right?
Right.
What other physical, before we get into kind of the deeper level, what are some observations we can make about this star that falls?
Yeah, that star or that cosmic can affect a really big, wide, space. It could also cause sometimes earthquakes, tsunamis, hurricanes, other natural disasters all throughout the earth. Not only that affects the creatures that are living on the land, but also humanity itself.
Impacts upon earth by heavenly bodies are also often tied in the ancient world with mystical sites, sites of worship, sites where the heavens touched the earth. And that's going to kind of transfer us into, I think, what's going on with this, all right? Hopefully the statement there, a star that fell, stood out to you.
Yeah.
Because even if you haven't spent a lot of time studying your Bible, you know this imagery of falling stars is often tied with fallen angels
Right.
or rebellious angels or angels being cast out of heaven. Okay, so remember, we have the throwing language specifically tying us to the destruction of Babylon. Now we have the falling language, and could it be that this fallen star language is meant to specifically remind us and tie us into the idea of fallen or rebellious angels? You think it could?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What are some examples of these fallen stars that we see?
Yeah. Well, we've kind of already seen the fact with stars and angels already in Revelation that we've already talked about that symbolizes those things. We'll actually kind of see that in Revelation. Is it chapter 12? Right? Yeah. So we're going to see that come into play in that story. We won't get it too ahead of ourselves right there. But like that plays so much significance. We even see when we talked about the minor prophets, about the day of the Lord language, about stars and about the sun and the moon darkening and them falling down on the earth, from Joel to Hosea to Amos. Those also represent this divine forces that are coming down to earth. Yeah.
Our two classic passages about the fall of Satan, Isaiah chapter 14 and Ezekiel chapter 28, both of these refer to the Satan figure, the devil figure, as a fallen star.
Yeah.
Right? And so, and in fact, our very first verse of chapter 9 of the book of Revelation is going to talk about a falling star. Okay? Now, fallen star doesn't necessarily mean rebelling angel.
Right.
A falling star can simply be an angel that travels from the heavens to the earth. But the idea of stars and falling should make you think of angelic powers. It should make you think of supernatural forces that are at play here.
Yeah.
Now, John adds an extra detail here that's not needed for the pattern of this book, but he goes ahead and tells us in verse 11, the name of the star is wormwood. A third of the waters became wormwood, and many people died from the water because it had been made bitter. Now, what's up with this name wormwood?
Yeah, actually, we see that name, or even just wormwood, repeated often throughout the Old Testament. Actually, wormwood is considered this plant that is considered poisonous and bitter when drank, and we actually see that when kind of examples of I think it's in Exodus chapter 15 where they're out in the wilderness drinking water and something happens and God makes it be that way, and He says now the water is bitter. We also see it. Proverbs 5:3-4 about the fact of an adulterous woman has words like wormwood, that it's considered bitter. Lamentations 3:15 and 19. Same thing. Amos 5-7, 6-12, and Hosea 10-4 about this wormwood, this poisonous, this bitterness that affects the world in itself. Yeah.
So at the very least, we can say here that the falling of this angel, the descent of this angel upon the earth, is causing bitterness and poison and great suffering across the whole earth, right? That seems to be the trajectory of this. Now, interestingly enough, I noted that the impacts where meteors hit the earth often become occult sites, right? Wormwood is also used in occult practices. Wormwood is actually the source of one of the world's oldest narcotics. So one of the earliest forms of mind-altering drugs was made through refined wormwood. And wormwood would have been used in these magic rituals, these pagan worship services, in order to alter the state of the mind, in order to contact these spiritual beings. In fact, wormwood is the base ingredient of the form of alcohol that we know of today as absinthe, which is again a mind-altering alcohol, a mood-altering alcohol that exists even in our world today. But what I want to draw your attention to is that wormwood was closely tied to putting humans in an altered state in order to contact dark spiritual forces, evil spiritual forces, which I think adds another layer of why John is using this phrase wormwood here. There's the bitterness aspect, the poison aspect that I think is the primary referent, but there's this secondary referent underneath that of its ties to occultism, of its ties to sort of dark spiritual practices, in particular of the nations outside of Israel, those that did not worship Yahweh, right?
Yeah.
So how do we summarize this this act here? I think I have my opinion on what might be going on here. But what would you say is the primary meaning here of this third trumpet and the falling of the star named Wormwood?
Yeah, so I think the meaning we see is not only do we see the nation on earth, this kingdom of Babylon is going to be destroyed, but we're going to even see that these fallen angels, not just Wormwood, but Satan and all these other ones who are not following and trusting the Lord, these ones who've wanted control of all things, there is judgment for them too. And they're going to have the judgment that's going to happen on earth. And we're seeing that right here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I agree with that completely. I think that's exactly what this is referring to. Is the second trumpet is referring to the judgment of evil human empires, and this trumpet is referring to the judgment of these fallen evil principalities and powers, these spiritual forces that are behind those. Kelson mentioned earlier the waters and the way that water represents chaos in Hebrew literature. Here in a few chapters, we're going to get to the great dragon in chapter 13, Satan, summoning the Antichrist from the waters. The Antichrist is the beast from the waters. And so it's significant here that part of the judgment that God is pouring out is not only on the mountains and the stars, again, human empires and angelic principalities, but he is also judging the chaos. He's judging the world and the systems that allow these things to exist. God is getting rid of the water, so to speak. God is getting rid of the chaos that exists here. And we have this dual judgment. Okay? Now, a question I have, and I legitimately am not sure where I stand on this, is Wormwood, this fallen star, is it one particular angelic being, or is it one being used to talk about all?
I don't know.
I don't know either. It could be one particular entity. This could be talking about the judgment of Satan. And we're going to see later passages that talk about the binding of Satan, the destruction of Satan. And again, and I've gone through this in some of my long explanations of chronology, the book of Revelation circles in on itself.
Right.
And so me personally, I have no problem with finding a judgment of Satan here in Revelation 8, as well as later in chapter 20 and chapter 21, because I think that the book of Revelation is circular. I think it loops back on itself in multiple times, and we may be seeing one of these loops where it's talking about the judgment of the great evil dragon, the judgment of Satan, and then later it's going to give us more detail about the judgment of Satan. Just like chapter 18 is going to give us more detail about the judgment of Babylon. Okay, so me personally, I don't have a problem with that. If you have a strict linear view of Revelation, if you think Revelation is laid out A, B, C, D, and there is a chronology that goes from beginning to end, then you're not going to be able to take that view, because you can't have the judgment of Satan occurring here before you have Satan empowering the Antichrist. But if you take my view, which is again this looping, the circular chronology of the book of Revelation, in which Revelation can telescope and talk about things at the end of the book as well as making references at the beginning of the book, all in one area, then you have no problem with Revelation talking about the judgment of both the Antichrist empire and Satan's empire before that has been introduced. You have no issue with that because of the looping nature. Just like with the seals, in my view, the last of the seals talks about the unmaking of the cosmos, right? I don't have an issue with that because of the looping nature that I think Revelation has. So that's just something to say about the chronology. That's been kind of my hobby horse on these episodes. The chronology and the sort of the presuppositions you make coming into the book of Revelation about how you're going to take this material, right?
Right.
Now, I will say this, back to this issue, is Wormwood representative of all rebellious spiritual powers? Is it one particular spiritual power? I don't know. However, the fourth trumpet may provide an answer to that. Because in the fourth trumpet, we're going to have... Well, before I move on to the fourth, do you have anything you want to add about Wormwood and the third trumpet?
No, I just keep going back to... if you haven't read Screwtape Letters by C.S. Lewis, I would highly recommend. But C.S. Lewis actually talks about this person named Wormwood, who goes after this one particular character, as we see throughout the story, of convincing him and tempting him to not follow the ways of the Lord. And so I think of wormwood not only in the Bible, I also think of the Screwtape Letters as well. Yeah.
So verse 12, the fourth angel blew his trumpet, and a third of the sun was struck, and a third of the moon, and a third of the stars, so that a third of their light might be darkened, and a third of the day might be kept from shining, and likewise a third of the night. So again, before we get into the weird stuff, let's zoom out. Let's talk about it overall. We've had a judgment of the earth.
Yep.
We've had 2 judgments of the sea. Now we're moving to the heavens. Okay, so notice how all the cosmos is being judged through these trumpets. This may be the most surreal of all these judgments. Again, we can in our mind picture what a volcano exploding looks like and what it looks like to have God pick up a volcano and throw it into the sea. We can picture in our minds the falling of a comet. We can picture in our minds hail and fire falling from heavens. What does it look like for a third of the sun to not shine? Like, is it a pie chart? Is it just a little bit dimmer? I don't know. Okay, what does it look like for a third of the day to not shine? We're steadily getting beyond the realms of human imagination, which tells you we're probably moving into more and more interpretive, literary items, right? This, unlike the volcano, the comet, and the hail, the idea of a third of the sun, a third of the moon, and a third of the stars not shining is not as easy for our imaginations to grasp. Do you kind of agree with that? Yeah, and so it's becoming a little bit more surreal here as we imagine that, which again is indicating that this is not necessarily meant to be taken completely literally. There are supernatural elements behind this. There are literary elements behind this that we are meant to be thinking about as we go through this. But just in general, Kelson, what do you make of the third of the sun and the third of the moon and the third of the suns being darkened?
Yeah, so we actually see this as the fourth day of creation when God created the sun, the moon, the stars, and the planets. We also see that this is...
So just let me pause there, because I actually think this is a really significant point.
Yes.
I don't want people to miss this.
No, for sure.
The fourth trumpet directly lines up with the fourth day of creation.
Yeah.
In the fourth day of creation, God creates the sun, the moon, the stars, and he creates those things to govern the night and the day.
Right.
And since that day of creation, those things, with an exception in the book of Joshua and an exception in the book of Hezekiah, those things have always worked.
Yeah.
Okay. But here, God, again, we've talked about this unmaking.
Right.
God is now reversing for the first time what he set in motion on the fourth day of creation.
Right.
And the fourth trumpet and the fourth day are meant to be mirrors of each other. And that's really significant, what she just pointed out. So,
I also think it's significant because we see that it's the ninth plague of the Exodus that lasted, here we go, 3 days. The trumpet, that sounds the third of the sun, the third of the moon, the third of the stars. I think that's also significant. That plague of darkness lasted 3 days. And we see that there's 3 of those things of the sun, moon, and stars. One, just even a third of it, is going to be completely struck by, you know what I mean, darkened, a little bit of light from shining, which I also think is very significant.
We also have and it just needs to be mentioned because of the parallel here, we have Revelation chapter 12, and this is a passage where a lot of people are somewhat familiar with, but you have the war of heaven that takes place. The great dragon was thrown down. This is chapter 12, verse 9. I think this is right. No, sorry. Go back to chapter 4. Or sorry, chapter 12, verse 4 of Revelation. The dragon's tail, swept down a third of the stars of heaven and cast them to the earth. And almost everyone who reads that passage understands the sweeping down of the stars as referring to angels, right? And you have that same number, third. That's not, I think, an accident that John is doing that. You also have in verse 9, which is where I started and then backed up. And the great dragon was thrown down. We have that language of being thrown down. The ancient serpent who is called Devil and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world. He was thrown down to the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. Okay, so we have this star angel language right here in Revelation chapter 12 tied to the third.
Right.
Okay, that should be making you think of things as you think of stars being thrown down, being darkened, a third. All these are linked conceptually, right?
Right.
Yeah. So, in my view, and well, I wouldn't say in my view. So, when you look at biblical literature, the sun, the moon, the stars, they are frequently compared to the heavenly host.
Yes.
Right?
Right.
Stars, sun, moon, they are viewed as equaling, as similar to the angels. This is why one of the warnings that Israel's given is not to worship the sun, the moon, and the stars. And that is tied to the idea of idolatry and worshiping other gods. And so the gods that the nations worshiped, they believe those things to be stars, suns, moons.
Right.
When John here in Revelation is discussing this, I still think he has in mind, just like with the fallen star of Wormwood, he still has in mind the judgment of the heavenly host.
Yeah.
This is where the angels are being judged. Now, could this mean a literal physical darkening as well? Sure. It could.
Yeah.
But what I think the primary meaning is that this now fourth trumpet is a removing power from, a judgment of, a throwing down, a darkening of the glory of the heavenly host. Those rebel angels, those angels who stand in opposition to what God's plan is. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. And then I also think it goes back to, if this is sounding familiar, this is also going back to this whole the day of the Lord language, those things that we've talked about that with Joel and Amos and Hosea. And so just even to name a few, we see actually Joel 2, verse 10 through 11. The earth quakes before them, the heavens tremble. The sun and the moon are darkened, and the stars withdraw their shining. The Lord utters his voice before his army, for his camp is exceedingly great. Right? Talking about these armies from the supernatural, from the fallen to the heavenly beings. Exceedingly great, for who executes his word is powerful. For the day of the Lord is great and very awesome. Who can endure it? And then we also have Amos chapter 8, verse 9. And on that day declares the Lord God, I will make the sun go down at noon and darken the earth in broad daylight. And then it goes on through this fact of feast turn into mourning, songs into lamentation, all that stuff. But this is a new concept. Even the minor prophets are talking about the day of the Lord that's happening here in Revelation.
Yeah. I also think, now this is just me kind of theory crafting here. I believe the angels were created on the fourth day of creation. And I believe that because of that strong link and language between stars and angels. And so I think when God creates the sun, the moon, and the stars, he also creates the angels on that fourth day. And so that just ties back into this fourth trumpet being the unmaking or the judgment of that which was created on the fourth day. If we need to draw a distinction between Wormwood and the stars that are judged here. And again, this is not something I'm dogmatic on. This is just something that I'm trying to fill in the gaps. I'm trying to understand using ancient literature, using my knowledge of kind of the Hebrew supernatural worldview. What might be going on here? The wormwood, this is tied to water. This is tied to chaos. This is tied to what happens on the earthly realm, right? And so with that, you can view wormwood as either a judgment of Satan specifically or a judgment of those demons and Satan's armies which have power and authority here on this earth. The stars that are judged, this could be a reference to the principalities, the rulers, the authorities that Paul talks about in books like Ephesians and Colossians and Corinthians, the gods of Psalm 82. If you go back and read Psalm 82 or listen to the episode that I did just on Psalm 82, right? This is a judgment of the powers and principalities that serve as gods over the nations. You may not need to draw a distinction, though. What we may be seeing here with these first four plagues might be just as simple as a judgment of all rebellious human enterprises, as well as all rebellious spiritual heavenly host. What's going on? You have a judgment of wicked human rebels and a judgment of wicked angelic rebels. And that's what these first 4 trumpets are all pointing towards, right? Do you have anything to add to that? Well, now the trumpets are going to take a break before we get to the rest of the trumpets in chapter 9. And with this break, what we're going to get is we're going to get this very interesting verse here. Verse 13, "Then I looked and heard an eagle crying with a loud voice as it flew directly overhead. Woe, woe, woe to those who dwell on the earth, at the blast of the other trumpets that the 3 angels are about to blow." So what is going on with this eagle, and why on earth is this eagle now calling out to John in preparation of the final 3 trumpets? Do you have any thoughts on the eagle?
Yeah, actually, so looking back in ancient literature, the eagle was regarded as a messenger for Zeus. So here we've already kind of seen already from past episodes where John uses terms for Jesus and for what he has done going against Zeus. So this isn't a new concept. And so here we even see the fact that this eagle, which is part of the 4 living creatures, which is the last one that's introduced, that this eagle is also considered this messenger, not just now for Zeus, what people would have thought back then, but for Jesus, for God, bringing judgment, going again about this fact of that I am Jesus, who was, who is to come, the Almighty God, the one who deserves the highest of praise. You know what I mean? That term of I am he who is he, which that's what Zeus used to be called. I think Jesus is even calling out here saying, like, you think they were it? I'm it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And let me, there's 2 different ways to view what this eagle is doing. On the one hand, you can view the eagle as being loyal to God and being used by God as a herald, much like the angels are. Okay. On the other hand, you could view the eagle as a rebel who is fleeing from this destruction that's taking place. In either case, with what you've just pointed out, with the eagle being identified with Zeus, you have a submission of Zeus to Jesus.
Yes.
Because on the one hand, you have now the spirit of Zeus being used not as a herald of Zeus, but as a herald of Jesus.
Right.
If it's loyal to Jesus. On the other hand, you may have Zeus himself fleeing like a wounded animal from the judgment that's taking place, as we've just read about the falling and the judgment of the stars and the principalities and the powers of which Zeus would be one. Okay, so go on.
Yeah, so I think that's really interesting. And then Michael Heiser really goes into this. I thought this was just really fascinating. But just this this eagle, if we're talking, we've already talked about how important stars is and like constellations. But this the eagle would actually be in the position of the constellation of Pegasus, which we see that Pegasus, Scorpio, Leo, Tarsus are all part of this, celestial equator. These represented the 4 different seasons in the Babylonian period. Okay, so which I think that's all really important if we're talking about Babylon and all that stuff.
Which also has interesting parallels with the 4 living creatures of chapter 4.
Of chapter 4. So I just think that's just really interesting. And even the fact, too, of with the Pegasus was considered this leader, this divine out of the 4, out of the thing, but also in this possession. If you look at the stars, it's this considered word called mid-heaven, which we're already talking about, right? Of the earth having judgment, the seas, now the heavens and the cosmic being, and the mid-heavens being unraveled in itself. And I think it's really important because, you know what I mean, Zeus, all these other guys would be considered that, but God is showing up saying, no, I'm the one who's in control of all things. I'm the one who created and brought peace in that, but now I'm unraveling what I have already created from the very beginning. Yeah.
That Greek constellation of Pegasus was the thunderbird of Babylonian astrology.
Okay. Yeah.
And it was an eagle in Babylonian astrology. We've already been talking about the significance of Babylon to all of this. And so John may be again hinting at this sort of Babylonian idea here, this Babylonian religion, which is an older form of the Greek religion in this way. And remember, the ancient, the nations, those who were not Jewish, they would have viewed the constellations as manifestations
Yes.
of their gods. Jewish works view the constellations as manifestations of the false gods. And so they would view it in the same way, they just wouldn't worship those things.
Right.
And so you have, again, this idea of perhaps the eagle is the constellation Pegasus, or the thunderbird of Babylonia, and it is fleeing as you see this unmaking of the mid-heaven or of the sky on the fourth day of creation. Now, if you look at the idea, or did you have anything else you wanted to add to?
No, you go for
Okay.
it, and then if I'll, yeah.
If you look at the way that the image of eagle is used in the Bible, so first of all, John himself uses this image of the eagle 3 different times in the book of Revelation.
Yep.
In chapter 4, verse 7, we've already run across this. One of the living creatures is an eagle,
Right.
and that may be a reference back to that constellation. These constellations within which, in John's mind, they are not worthy of worship, but in fact they worship God. And so there's this idea of the eagle living creature in chapter 4, verse 7. There's this reference in verse 13 of chapter 8, and then in chapter 12, verse 14, there is the woman who is the nation of Israel who is given the wings of an eagle in order to flee from the dragon. Okay. More on that in a bit, but there's this idea that the eagle is the power of God to deliver people from judgment that is coming. When you look at the Old Testament, the idea of eagle is used a lot, and it has a lot of different images behind it. Eagles are often representations or pictures of foreign nations and rulers that God uses to judge Israel and to rule over Israel. Eagles are used to describe proud and haughty nations, like the nation of Edom, okay, is referred to as an eagle that hides in the mountains or the rocks that no one can bring down, but God himself will pluck and bring down. And there's several references to eagles being angelic beings. We get this in Ezekiel 1 and 10, which Revelation 4 is based off of. Also in Daniel chapter 7, one of the beasts of the book of Daniel has the wings of an eagle. And so there's this supernatural element behind these eagles. God himself, a couple times, he is an eagle who protects his threatened nest like a mother eagle would. And the eagle is used as an image of God's judgment and wrath. Now let's go back to this idea of deliverance. The woman who's given wings like an eagle and brought into the wilderness, this seems to be a direct reference to Exodus 19:14, where it says that God gives his people wings of eagle to escape from Egypt. We also have Psalm 103, verse 5, and of course Isaiah 40:31, both of which talking about being renewed like an eagle, being delivered, being given new strength. Maybe even has this sort of glorification idea behind it, where we will be renewed as eagles, and so we will join the heavenly family of God whenever God brings about the resurrection. So all these different data points, all these different ideas. But what I hope you see here is that the eagle, at the very least, has this sort of angelic, supernatural idea behind it.
Right.
So in the same way that stars are angels, eagles can be angels. And I do think what's taking place here in verse 13 is the eagle is fleeing the destruction. The eagle is trying to run away from this judgment. And so the eagle here, either representing Zeus or representing the false forms of worship in the world, it is failing, it is falling in the face of God's judgment. And so it is trying to flee, but there will be no flee because the next trumpets will sound. And all that's going to happen is going to be God. God will win, even over this eagle that's fleeing. So anything else you want to add to that?
No, I actually never thought of it that way, because I'll be honest, I interpret it more as the eagle of the living creature, not the eagle of that, which makes a lot of sense, honestly.
It's
you know
ambiguous.
What I mean? It's ambiguous, but I guess what I was saying, that was really eye-opening, because I never would have interpreted that way, because I interpret it the other way, which I think is really good. Yeah.
And I think for Kelsey and I both, we would say, okay, there's and what we've talked about, there's some big picture things that we are really, really sure on.
Right.
We're really, really sure that the trumpets are referring to the unmaking of the world, the judgment of human and angelic rebels, and ultimately paving the way for Christ's kingdom that's going to reign on this earth.
Yeah.
Like 100%, we would say, that's what this is talking about. There's also some things that, we have strong suspicions about.
Right.
We have our theories on, but we're not going to teach those things as necessary doctrine.
Right.
Like the chronology of all this, when this is occurring, how this is occurring, what's taking place. Is Wormwood Satan? Is Wormwood another angelic being? Is Wormwood just a collective for angelic beings and demons? It's difficult to know, right? Is there a physical volcano that's going to explode and a physical meteorite that's going to hit the earth? We don't know.
No.
Another thing I don't know is I can never keep the difference between meteorite and meteor apart. I know one of them hits the earth and one doesn't. So whichever of those two actually hits the earth, okay, some people would say that's a literal interpretation here. I would say I'm not sure.
We're not sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
It could be an image. It could be literal. It could be an image. I highly suspect it's referring to something deeper than just a physical volcano or a physical meteor/meteorite. But I again, that's not something that I'm going to plant my flag on and say, I have my suspicions. There's other things that are really ambiguous that we would just say, I don't know.
Yeah.
Okay. There's a lot of that going on here. But when you're in the middle of the I don't knows, always take yourself back to the I know this for sure. And the I know this for sure is that God wins, and those who are faithful to him will be rewarded no matter how bad it gets during the judgment. So that would be kind of my conclusion to chapter 8.
I think that's a really good conclusion.
All right. Do you have any specific applications for us as we begin to move on? Or are we going to continue to look at the trumpets before we kind of draw our applications?
I think we should continue to look at the trumpets because they're kind of a whole,
Yeah.
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 But I think you're right in saying specifically what we've just looked at. It is the elemental forces of nature that is unraveling during this time that God is doing, the reversal of creation itself. Yeah.
Yeah. Which will be spectacular to behold.
Yes.
Right?
Right.
It will be great and terrible, as the prophets say.
Yes.
So, yeah. Well, I think that's a great place for us to wrap us up.